Billionaire Victoria Sterling had exactly 24 hours to find a husband, or she'd lose the media empire she bled to build. She expected a quiet, transactional marriage with a vetted stranger. Instead, a struggling single father looked her dead in the eye and demanded, "Then kiss me right now." The penthouse office in the Woolworth building was silent, save for the rhythmic, hollow ticking of a vintage Patek Philippe desk clock. It was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Global Communications, sat behind a slab of Italian marble that served as her desk, staring at a legally binding document that felt more like a death warrant. Her net worth was publicly estimated at $1.4 billion, but on paper, her actual control hung by a thread thinner than dental floss. When her grandfather, Arthur Sterling, passed away, he had locked the controlling 51% of the company's voting shares in a generation-skipping trust managed by the notoriously ruthless law firm Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom. Arthur was an old-world traditionalist who despised Victoria's hyper-independent, workaholic lifestyle. The morality clause in the trust was as archaic as it was ironclad. Victoria would inherit the voting rights on her 35th birthday, provided she was legally married. If she was single at the stroke of midnight, the proxy rights defaulted to the board of directors, effectively handing the company to her uncle, Richard Hayes. Richard had already drafted the paperwork to liquidate Sterling Global and sell the assets to a private equity firm in Boston. Victoria had spent the last 10 years turning a failing print media dinosaur into a digital powerhouse. She wasn't going to let Richard gut it for a quick payout. Tomorrow was her 35th birthday. She had 25 hours left. "Next," Victoria said, her voice dry, rubbing her temples. Her executive assistant, a notoriously tight-lipped woman named Sarah, ushered a man into the room. He was the fourth candidate of the night. His name was Preston Cole, a mid-level investment banker from Goldman Sachs. He was polished, wearing a Brioni suit, with a resume that had been heavily vetted by Victoria's private investigators. "Miss Sterling," Preston said, flashing a practiced, predatory smile. He took a seat without being offered one. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Preston," Victoria said, sliding a thick file across the marble. "The terms are simple. You sign an ironclad prenuptial agreement waiving all rights to my assets, present and future. We file a marriage license tomorrow at City Hall. We remain married on paper for 24 months to satisfy the board's probationary period. In exchange, I wire $5 million into an offshore account of your choosing, tax-free. You live your life, I live mine." Preston didn't touch the file. He leaned back, crossing his legs. $5 million is a generous offer, Victoria. But I did some digging. If you lose the company tomorrow, your uncle cashes out for roughly $3 billion. You're desperate. I think my signature is worth $20 million, and a seat on the board. Victoria's blue eyes went ice cold. It was extortion, plain and simple. She felt a sudden, suffocating panic tighten her chest, but her face remained a mask of stone. "You're overplaying your hand." "Am I?" Preston smirked. "Who else are you going to find at midnight? Pay up, Victoria, or I walk right out that door and call Richard Hayes myself?" Before Victoria could press the silent security button under her desk, the heavy oak doors to her office swung open. A man stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore dark denim, heavy work boots, and a charcoal gray Henley that stretched across broad, tired shoulders. A tool belt hung loosely from one hand. This was David Callahan, the independent security contractor hired to overhaul the penthouse's biometric locks after a recent data breach. Victoria frowned. "Callahan, we are in a private meeting." David walked slowly into the room, his jaw set. He stopped right behind Preston's chair. Up close, Victoria noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the subtle scar cutting through his left eyebrow, and the sheer, grounded mass of him. He didn't belong in a billionaire's office. He looked like a man who built the office with his bare hands. "Sorry to interrupt, Miss Sterling," David said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the quiet room. "But the biometric scanner on the private elevator is wired, and I need to get my daughter home. She's asleep in your lobby." "Have Sarah sign off on your timesheet," Victoria snapped, stressed. "Now get out." Preston scoffed, looking back at David with blatant disgust. "You heard her, wrench monkey. Let the adults finish talking. We were just negotiating my 20 million. David looked down at Preston. The contractor's eyes were dark, tired, and completely devoid of patience. "Actually," David said quietly, "I overheard the whole thing through the vents while I was calibrating the HVAC security sensors. You're trying to shake her down." "It's none of your business," Preston sneered, standing up to face David. "It was a mistake." Preston was tall, but David was built like a heavyweight boxer who had survived too many late rounds. David didn't yell. He didn't posture. He simply dropped his tool belt onto the floor with a heavy thud, reached out and clamped his large, calloused hand firmly onto Preston's shoulder. His grip was visibly crushing. "The lady offered you 5 million. You got greedy," David said, his voice dropping an octave. "Now you're getting 0. Walk out of this building right now, or I'll throw you out the window and tell the cops the biometric locks malfunctioned." Preston's face paled. He looked at Victoria for intervention, but she was watching David with sudden, sharp calculation. Preston jerked his shoulder out of David's grip, snatched his briefcase, and hurried out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Silence fell over the room. David picked up his tool belt, shaking his head. "You need better screening for your fake husbands, boss." He turned to leave. "Wait," Victoria said. The word came out sharper than she intended. David paused, looking back at her. "I'm off the clock, Miss Sterling." Victoria's mind was racing. The clock on her desk ticked. 11:15 p.m. She had run out of vetted candidates. Her lawyers were out of options. But she knew David's file. Before hiring Callahan Security Solutions, her team had run a deep background check on him. David Callahan, 34 years old, former Marine Force Recon, honorably discharged, widowed 3 years ago when his wife, Sarah, died of aggressive ovarian cancer. He was left raising a 6-year-old daughter, Chloe, on his own. More importantly, Victoria knew about the financial ruin the American healthcare system had left him in. He owed over $400,000 in medical debt. Chase Bank was 72 hours away from foreclosing on his modest 2-bedroom home in Astoria, Queens. He was drowning. "Sit down, Mr. Callahan," Victoria commanded. David narrowed his eyes. "I have a sleeping kid out there. Bring her in," Victoria countered. "Sit down. I have a business proposition for you." 10 minutes later, David sat opposite Victoria. His daughter, Chloe, a tiny thing with messy brown curls, was sound asleep on the custom $15,000 Roche-Beaubois sofa in the corner, covered by David's worn denim jacket. David watched the girl for a long moment before turning his hardened gaze back to the billionaire across the desk. $2 million, Victoria said, skipping the preamble entirely. 1 million deposited into a mutual fund for Chloe's education and future, untouchable by anyone but her. 1 million wired directly to your Chase private client account by 8 a.m. tomorrow. It will clear your medical debts, save your house in Astoria, and leave you enough to expand your security business. David didn't blink. And in exchange, I play your lapdog for a judge? In exchange, we go to the county clerk's office at 9 a.m. We sign a marriage license. We stay legally married for 2 years, Victoria corrected, maintaining strict eye contact. You will sign a prenup drafted by Skadden Arps. We will live in this penthouse to maintain optics for the board of directors. You will have your own wing. You will continue your life. I will continue mine. It is purely a transaction. David leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He looked at the paperwork, then at her. Victoria was undeniably stunning, sharp cheekbones, flawless porcelain skin. her blonde hair pulled back in a severe, immaculate twist. But she looked rigid, like a woman made of glass who was terrified of shattering. "You're out of your mind," David said bluntly. "I am a realist," she fired back. "My Uncle Richard has hired Kroll private investigators to trail me. He knows I'm desperate. If I show up married to a polished Wall Street stooge like Preston, Richard will tie it up in Delaware Chancery Court as a fraudulent marriage meant to circumvent the trust. He'll argue I bought a proxy, and what makes me any different?" Victoria paused. "Because you are the exact opposite of my world. You are blue collar. You are a single father. You have a tragic backstory. If I marry you, the press will eat it up. It won't look like a corporate merger. It will look like a reckless, passionate, out-of-character emotional breakdown. It's the only narrative Richard can't challenge in a boardroom." David let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking over at his sleeping daughter. The thought of losing their home had kept him awake for months. He had sold his truck, his retirement fund, everything to keep them afloat. $2 million was a lifeline he couldn't afford to ignore. "A fake marriage," David murmured, almost to himself. He looked back at Victoria, his eyes hardening. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? You think you can just buy a human being with a wire transfer. I am offering a mutual exchange of services." "Stop talking like a corporate prospectus," David snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. It genuinely startled Victoria. Nobody ever interrupted her. "This isn't a merger, Victoria. If Kroll investigators are watching you, they aren't stupid. They look for affection. They look for history. They look for the way a husband looks at his wife when the cameras are off." He stood up, pacing slowly toward her desk. His sheer physical presence dominated the sterile office. "If we do this, it's not going to be on your terms," David said, stopping right in front of her. "I'm not going to be a ghost in a separate wing of your house. If we have to sell this to ruthless corporate sharks, we have to actually sell it. We eat dinner together. We hold hands in public. I drive your car. I walk into your boardrooms. We make them believe that a billionaire ice queen actually lost her mind and fell in love with the guy fixing her locks." Victoria's breath hitched. Her carefully constructed walls were being tested. "I can act," she said coldly. "I run a billion-dollar company. I fake confidence every day." David leaned down, placing both his rough hands flat on the cold marble of her desk, bringing his face inches from hers. She could smell sawdust, rain, and cheap coffee on him. It was jarringly real. "Acting in a boardroom is easy," David said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "Faking intimacy with a stranger when everything you own is on the line? That takes something you don't have." "I have exactly what it takes," she whispered back, refusing to break eye contact. "I need a husband by tomorrow." David's gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, then snapped back to her eyes. "Then kiss me right now." The silence in the room was absolute. Victoria froze. "What?" "You heard me," David challenged, his eyes locked onto hers, entirely unyielding. "If Richard Hayes walks into the room right now, you need to be able to convince him I'm the love of your life. If you can't even touch me when it's just the two of us, this whole plan burns down tomorrow. Prove to me you can fake it. Kiss me." It was a test, a power play to show her that she couldn't control everything with money. Victoria Sterling never backed down from a challenge. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a strange, frantic bird in her chest. She stood up slowly. She was tall, but she still had to tilt her head up to meet his gaze. She closed the distance between them. She reached up, her perfectly manicured hands resting on the rough fabric of his Henley. She could feel the hard, steady thumping of his heart beneath her palms. He didn't move. He let her initiate. Victoria leaned up and pressed her lips to his. She expected it to be clinical. She planned to give him a brief, forceful kiss to prove her point and sit back down. But the moment their lips touched, the entire dynamic shifted. David didn't just accept the kiss. He took it over. His large hand slid around the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her immaculate twist of hair, destroying her perfect updo in a second. He pulled her flush against his chest. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was fierce, desperate, and surprisingly hungry. It carried the weight of a man who had been fighting the world alone for years, colliding with a woman who had built a fortress of ice around herself. For a terrifying, exhilarating second, Victoria forgot about the trust, the board, and the deadline. She gasped into his mouth, her hands gripping his shirt to keep her balance as a jolt of raw electricity shot down her spine. When David finally broke the kiss, he didn't step back immediately. He kept his hand on the nape of her neck, his forehead resting lightly against hers. They were both breathing heavily. Victoria's lips were swollen, her eyes wide and shocked. Slowly, David stepped back. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, though a muscle in his jaw feathered. "All right," David said quietly, his voice slightly raspy. "You can fake it." Victoria swallowed hard, struggling to reassemble her shattered composure. She smoothed her skirt, refusing to acknowledge the tremor in her hands. "So, do we have a deal?" "We have a deal," David said, turning back to look at his sleeping daughter. "But I have one condition that isn't in your Skadden Arps contract." Victoria immediately went on the defensive. "I am not renegotiating the money." "Keep your money," David said, turning back to face her. "My condition is about Chloe. My daughter has lost enough people in her life. If you bring her into this fake world of yours, you do not treat her like a prop. You treat her with kindness. And when this is over in 2 years, you don't just vanish and break her heart. You figure out a way to exit her life gently. If you hurt my kid, Victoria, I swear to God, I'll tear your empire down myself." Victoria looked at the fierce, protective fire in the eyes of this blue-collar father. For the first time all night, she didn't feel like a CEO negotiating a merger. She felt human. "I agree," Victoria said softly. "Good," David said, picking up his tool belt. "Pick us up at 8 a.m. Dress casual. If we're eloping, you shouldn't look like you're going to a funeral." The morning of Victoria's 35th birthday brought a torrential, unforgiving New York downpour, washing the city in a cold, slate-gray light. Inside the stark, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Manhattan Marriage Bureau on Worth Street, the contrast between the bride and groom was sharp enough to cut glass. Victoria wore a tailored, ivory Alexander McQueen pantsuit that cost more than a reliable used car. Her posture was flawless, her expression an impenetrable mask of corporate focus. Flanking her were 2 senior partners from Skadden Arps, William Bradley and Thomas Sterling, distant cousins who functioned more like attack dogs. They clutched the prenuptial agreements like shields. Beside her stood David Callahan. He had kept his word about dressing down, though he had compromised by wearing a clean, dark navy blazer over a crisp white shirt and dark jeans. He looked undeniably striking, his rugged, battle-hardened features standing out wildly among the sea of polished lawyers and nervous, starry-eyed couples waiting for their numbers to be called. Chloe, clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit, sat quietly on a nearby wooden bench, her large brown eyes taking in the strange, tense adults. The wire transfer cleared at 8:03 a.m. "Mr. Callahan," William Bradley said, his voice a dry, disdainful whisper. He handed David a thick stack of documents. "The medical debt at Mount Sinai has been liquidated. Chase Bank has ceased foreclosure proceedings on the Astoria property. The $1 million educational trust for your daughter is active. Now, sign the non-disclosure agreements, the asset waivers, and the media blackout protocols." David didn't look at the lawyer. His dark eyes remained fixed on Victoria. She looked pale, the exhaustion of the midnight negotiations finally showing at the edges of her meticulous makeup. "I told you last night," David said, his deep voice carrying a quiet, dangerous weight that made William Bradley physically step back. "I'm not signing a media blackout protocol. If Kroll investigators are trailing us, setting up a blackout makes this look exactly like what it is, a corporate transaction. We act like a couple, or the board voids your proxy by Friday." Victoria nodded sharply, intervening before her lawyer could object. "He's right, William. Strike the blackout clause. Just give us the marriage license." At 9:14 a.m., exactly 46 minutes before the deadline that would trigger the trust's default clause, Victoria Sterling and David Callahan stood before a bored city clerk. They recited the standard, sterile vows. When the clerk told David he could kiss the bride, the air in the small room suddenly turned heavy. Victoria braced herself, remembering the fierce, breathless collision of their kiss the night before. But this time, David simply reached out, his rough thumb gently brushing a stray raindrop from her cheek, and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. It was a gesture of profound, unexpected tenderness that caught Victoria entirely off guard. It didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like a promise of protection. By 10 a.m., the signed and sealed marriage certificate was hand-delivered to the board of directors at Sterling Global. Uncle Richard's liquidation vote was legally paralyzed. Victoria had won the battle, but as she rode the private elevator up to her Woolworth penthouse with her new husband and a 6-year-old child, she realized the war was just beginning. The penthouse was a 7,000-square-foot monument to isolated wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of the Manhattan skyline. The floors were radiant heated Brazilian walnut. The art on the walls was original Rothko and Basquiat. It was beautiful, cold, and entirely unsuited for a child. "Okay, kiddo," David said, dropping his heavy canvas duffel bag onto the entryway's marble floor. The sound echoed ominously. "This is our new base camp." Chloe looked around, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and intimidation. She stepped carefully onto the vast expanse of a white, hand-woven Persian rug, looking back at her father as if asking permission to exist in such a pristine space. Victoria felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. She had spent her entire adult life fortifying this space against intruders, and now she had invited two into its center. "Sarah," Victoria called out. Her assistant appeared instantly from the home office wing. "Please show Mr. Callahan and Chloe to the East Wing. Have the decorators convert the guest study into a child's bedroom by tomorrow evening." And Victoria hesitated, looking at the worn stuffed rabbit in Chloe's hands. "Order some groceries. Real food, not just my meal prep services." David watched Victoria issue commands, his jaw tight. As Sarah led a bewildered Chloe down the long, art-lined hallway, David turned to face his new wife. "We need to establish some ground rules, boss," David said, stepping closer to her. "The rules are in the contract, David," Victoria replied, crossing her arms defensively. "The contract dictates the money. I'm talking about our lives," David countered. "Rule 1. You don't speak to my daughter through an assistant. If you have something to say to Chloe, you say it to her directly. She's not an employee. Rule 2. I handle the security of this penthouse from now on. I saw 3 blind spots in your camera coverage in the lobby alone. If Richard Hayes is playing dirty, your current security detail is too soft to stop him." Victoria bristled, her pride stung. "My security team consists of former Secret Service agents. And they work bankers' hours," David retorted bluntly. "I work 24/7, Rule 3, and this is the most important one." He closed the remaining distance between them, his towering frame forcing Victoria to look up. "When we are in public, you let me take the lead. You're used to controlling every room you walk into, Victoria. But right now, you are the target. Let me be the shield." For a long moment, Victoria stared into his unyielding eyes. She was utterly unaccustomed to yielding control to anyone, let alone a man she had essentially hired. But looking at David, she realized he wasn't trying to dominate her. He was establishing a tactical perimeter. He was doing exactly what she paid him for, just not in the way she expected. "Agreed," Victoria said softly, the fight draining out of her. "Are there any other rules?" David's hard expression softened just a fraction. "Yeah, Try to get some sleep. You look like you've been fighting a war for 10 years. I have, Victoria whispered, turning away before he could see the vulnerability fracture her carefully maintained facade. 3 weeks into the arrangement, the sheer, exhausting pressure of the deception began to weigh heavily on both of them. Richard Hayes had not retreated. Furious that his multi-billion-dollar payday had been thwarted by a last-minute City Hall elopement, Richard had weaponized the media. He leaked insinuations to Page Six and Bloomberg that the marriage was a fraudulent stunt. The paparazzi presence outside the Woolworth building tripled. To counteract the narrative, Victoria's PR team booked their first major public appearance, the annual Sterling Global Media Foundation Gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was a vicious, glittering shark tank filled with New York's elite, shareholders, and worst of all, Richard Hayes himself. "Hold still," Victoria murmured, her fingers deftly adjusting the silk bow tie at David's collar. They were standing in the cavernous walk-in closet of the master suite. David was encased in a bespoke midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo that Victoria had rush-ordered. It fit his broad, muscular frame perfectly, emphasizing a raw, dangerous elegance that made Victoria's breath catch slightly in her throat. She, in turn, wore a stunning, backless, emerald green Oscar de la Renta gown that clung to her like a second skin. "I feel like I'm wearing a straitjacket," David grumbled, shifting uncomfortably. He looked down at her, catching the faint scent of her expensive jasmine perfume. "Are you sure this is a good idea? Throwing ourselves into a room full of people who want to see you fail? We don't have a choice," Victoria said, smoothing the lapels of his jacket. Her hands lingered there for a second longer than necessary. "The board is watching. We have to prove that we are entirely, undeniably obsessed with each other." David's eyes darkened. "Then you need to relax, Victoria. You're completely rigid. If you walk out there looking like you're bracing for an impact, Richard will smell the blood in the water." Before she could argue, David's hands moved to her bare waist, his warm, rough palms resting against her skin where the fabric of the dress ended. A jolt of electricity spiked down her spine. He gently pulled her closer, eliminating the professional distance between them. "Breathe," he instructed quietly, his thumb lightly stroking the curve of her spine. "I've got your back tonight. I promise. Just follow my lead." When they arrived at the Met, the flashbulbs were blinding. Reporters shouted questions, trying to provoke a reaction. True to his word, David took control. He placed a firm, protective hand on the small of Victoria's back, guiding her smoothly through the chaos. When a particularly aggressive paparazzo lunged forward with a microphone, David didn't flinch or call for security. He simply shifted his mass, blocking the man effortlessly while flashing a relaxed, charming smile to the cameras, pulling Victoria tight against his side. Inside the Temple of Dindur, the atmosphere was thick with money, power, and unspoken hostility. Within 20 minutes, Richard Hayes materialized from the crowd, a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand and a predatory smile on his face. He was accompanied by a man Victoria didn't recognize, a sharp-eyed, unremarkable man in a cheap suit who stuck out among the billionaires. "Victoria, darling," Richard purred, his eyes raking over her and David. "Quite the performance tonight. You almost look like a real couple." "Hello, Richard," Victoria said, her voice dropping 20 degrees. "I'm surprised you showed up. I thought you were busy filing frivolous injunctions." Richard chuckled, though his eyes remained dead. "Just protecting the shareholders, my dear. Speaking of which, I brought a guest. This is Mr. Reynolds. He's an independent risk assessor I retained." David's posture shifted instantly. The relaxed, charming husband vanished, replaced by the lethal stillness of a former Marine. He recognized Reynolds' type immediately. Private intelligence. A corporate spy. "Is that right?" David said, his voice a low, warning rumble. He stepped slightly in front of Victoria. "Mr. Callahan," Reynolds said, pulling a small, black notebook from his breast pocket. "Fascinating background you have. Tell me, how does a man with $400,000 in medical debt and a failing independent security firm suddenly afford a penthouse in the Woolworth building? Unless, of course, the marriage certificate was a receipt for services rendered. Victoria's heart plummeted. They were trying to trigger a confession in public. She opened her mouth to issue a legal threat, but David beat her to it. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He simply smiled a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach his eyes. He leaned in close to Reynolds, invading his personal space with intimidating ease. "I live in that penthouse because my wife asked me to," David said, his tone conversational but laced with venom. "And as for my failing security firm, Mr. Reynolds, I'm good enough at my job to know that you've been sitting in a gray Dodge Charger across from Chloe's elementary school for the last 3 days." The color drained from Reynolds' face. Richard Hayes stiffened. "Now," David continued, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for the two men, "I am a very patient man when it comes to corporate games. But if I ever see you, or any of Kroll's bottom feeders, within a 5-mile radius of my daughter again, I won't call the police. I will dismantle you. Do you understand me?" Reynolds swallowed hard, taking a rapid step backward. He looked at Richard, nodded sharply, and quickly disappeared into the crowd. Richard's smug facade cracked, a flash of genuine uncertainty crossing his features. "You are playing a dangerous game, Victoria. Buying a thug won't save your proxy." He turned and stalked away. Victoria let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees felt weak. She turned to David, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and deep, profound gratitude. "He was watching Chloe?" she asked, her voice trembling with sudden fury. "I handled it," David said simply, his protective grip returning to her waist. He looked down at her, the coldness in his eyes melting away as he saw how shaken she was. "I told you, boss, I'm your shield. They aren't going to touch you. And they aren't going to touch her." In the middle of the glittering ballroom, surrounded by enemies and sharks, Victoria realized a terrifying truth. The contract, the money, the separate wings of the penthouse, none of it mattered anymore. She wasn't faking it for the cameras, and she wasn't acting for the board. She reached up, her hands trembling slightly, and cupped David's rough, stubble-covered jaw. Ignoring the hundreds of eyes fixed upon them, she pulled him down and kissed him. It was a kiss born not of desperation or strategy, but of absolute, consuming trust. David groaned softly against her lips, his arms wrapping tightly around her waist, lifting her entirely out of the corporate warfare and into a space that belonged only to them. The cameras flashed, capturing the undeniable truth. The Ice Queen had fallen, and the contract had just become dangerously real. The photograph of their kiss at the Metropolitan Museum of Art dominated the front page of the Wall Street Journal the next morning. The headline read, "The Billionaire and the Bodyguard, Sterling Global's Shocking Merger." Victoria sat at the massive kitchen island of her Woolworth penthouse, a cup of black coffee cooling in her hands. Beside her, David was methodically assembling a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for Chloe, who was coloring at the table. It was a picture of domestic tranquility that sharply contrasted with the corporate bloodbath awaiting them downtown. Sarah, Victoria's assistant, burst through the private elevator doors, her face pale. "Miss Sterling, it's Richard." He didn't wait for the quarterly review. He bypassed the New York courts and filed an emergency ex parte motion in the Delaware Court of Chancery at dawn. "He's claiming you've suffered a psychiatric break. He's petitioning for immediate receivership of your voting shares." Victoria's blood ran cold. "On what grounds?" "He bribed 3 of the independent board directors," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "They signed sworn affidavits stating your marriage is a symptom of severe erratic behavior and that David is a grifter manipulating you for the trust. Richard has scheduled an emergency proxy vote for 10 a.m. If he wins, the company is liquidated by noon. Victoria stood up, the chair scraping violently against the Brazilian walnut floor. The walls of her empire were finally caving in. She had played the game perfectly, but Richard was willing to burn the board to the ground to get his payout. David stopped making the sandwich. He wiped his hands on a dish towel, his expression hardening into stone. He looked at Victoria, seeing the sheer, devastating defeat in her eyes. The woman who never lost was out of moves. "Get your suit on," David said quietly, his gravelly voice cutting through the panic. "We're going to the office." "David, it's over," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking. "If he has 3 board members lying under oath, Delaware will grant the receivership." He won. "He didn't win," David replied, pulling his leather jacket from the stool. "He just made the biggest mistake of his life. He underestimated the wrench monkey." An hour later, Victoria and David pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Sterling Global boardroom. Richard Hayes was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by the 3 compromised board directors and his smug legal team from Sullivan and Cromwell. "Ah, the happy couple," Richard sneered, leaning back in his leather chair. "I'm afraid this meeting is closed to non-shareholders, Mr. Callahan. Security will see you out." David didn't move. He walked past Richard's lawyers and slammed a thick, black encrypted hard drive onto the center of the mahogany table. The heavy thud made the compromised directors flinch. "I'm not leaving," David said, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "And neither is my wife's company." Richard laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "You have no power here, contractor. The vote is already locked. Victoria, you are out." "Let's talk about power, Richard," David said, resting his hands on the table and leaning over the billionaire. "When Victoria hired me to upgrade the biometric security for this building, I didn't just change the locks. I audited the internal network traffic to find the vulnerabilities. You thought I was just a blue-collar guy with a tool belt. You didn't realize that in Marine Force Recon, I specialized in signals intelligence and cybersecurity." Richard's smug smile faltered. A bead of sweat formed on his temple. David pulled a remote from his pocket and clicked it. The massive screen behind them flashed to life, displaying a series of heavily encrypted offshore bank ledgers. "I found a back door in the server that someone was using to siphon funds," David continued, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. "At first, I thought it was a hacker. But the IP address traced back to your private office, Richard." Victoria stared at the screen, her breath catching as the numbers aligned. "You didn't just bribe these 3 directors to lie under oath," David said, pointing to the pale, shaking men across the table. "You paid them $5 million each. And you didn't use your own money. You embezzled it from the Sterling Media Foundation. You stole from a children's charity to fund a hostile corporate takeover. This is fabricated garbage," Richard shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "It's illegal wiretapping. It's inadmissible." "Actually," Victoria spoke up, her voice suddenly ringing with absolute, icy authority. Her posture straightened, the untouchable CEO returning in full force. "As the majority shareholder and acting CEO, I authorized a full internal security sweep. Mr. Callahan's findings are entirely legal." She looked at her uncle, her blue eyes devoid of any mercy. This was the hard karma he had spent years earning. "I sent these logs to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI's white-collar crime division in the Southern District of New York an hour ago. The authorities are waiting in the lobby right now, Richard." The boardroom descended into chaos. The 3 bribe directors immediately began screaming at Richard, scrambling to call their defense attorneys. Richard Hayes sat frozen, his face ashen, realizing that the rugged, underestimated single father he had mocked had just systematically dismantled his entire life. Victoria turned to David amidst the screaming suits. The corporate war was over. The bad actors were going to federal prison, and her empire was finally, permanently hers. She looked at the man who had stood between her and ruin. He wasn't just a shield anymore. He was her equal. Without a word, she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out the thick Skadden Arps prenuptial agreement they had signed weeks ago, and tore it cleanly in half, dropping the pieces onto the mahogany table. David looked at the shredded contract, then up at her, a slow, genuine smile breaking across his hardened features. "I told you," David whispered, pulling her flush against his chest, right there in the middle of the boardroom. No more contracts. The corporate world expected Victoria Sterling to fall, but she found her ultimate weapon in a man's society completely overlooked. By dismantling her uncle's greed with cold, calculated justice, she secured her empire and her heart. The ironclad contract was reduced to ash, replaced by a family forged in fire. They didn't just survive the ruthless boardroom, they conquered it, proving genuine love is the most powerful asset